So imagine this, you finally move into a place that's all yours, the piece you've worked for a decade, and then bam, your family shows up uninvited. They act like they own the place, demanding space, demanding control, and suddenly all that hard-earned freedom feels fragile. You can feel the tension, the betrayal, the stakes sky high. And trust me, this isn't just a simple argument, it's a battle for everything. Stick around, because what happens next? It's wild. I woke up to a quiet that felt almost unreal. The kind of quiet you don't just hear, you feel it, seeping into your bones. No yelling, no clattering dishes, no footsteps pounding overhead, just silence. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waking up to the chaos I'd known for decades. My apartment was bathed in soft, golden light from the early morning sun, painting the hardwood floors and casting long shadows across the room. I took a deep breath and let it fill my lungs, letting the aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the machine in the kitchen sneak up and curl around me. It was a ritual I'd craved for years, simple, comforting, almost sacred. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, feeling the high thread count sheets rustle beneath me, and stretched slowly, my muscles aching from yesterday's unpacking. Boxes still littered the corners, a reminder that I'd carried every fragile item myself because I couldn't trust movers with my grandmother's china. My body protested, but it wasn't just the physical exertion, it was the weight of 10 years finally catching up. 10 years of overworking, of sacrificing sleep, meals, and personal time to claw my way to this moment. 10 years of living in a world where my needs were always secondary, where someone else's drama dictated my mornings, my evenings, my life. The apartment smelled faintly of new wood and clean linen. The air was cool against my skin, and for the first time, it felt like mine, not borrowed, not invaded, not temporary. I padded to the kitchen, bare feet, whispering against the imported hardwood, and started the coffee maker, the gentle gurgle, the rich scent. It was intoxicating. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my hands, feeling a kind of safety I hadn't known I could actually achieve. It wasn't the Italian marble countertops, or the panoramic view from the floor-to-ceiling windows, or the soft thud of my own steps on the polished floors that made this moment special. It was the silence. The quiet was more expensive than anything money could buy. It was my sanctuary, my victory. Sitting at the kitchen counter, I sipped the coffee slowly, letting it warm my chest. Each taste was a reminder of the freedom I'd earned, the independence I'd fought tooth and nail for. I could stay here as long as I wanted, do what I wanted, and no one could demand otherwise. No manipulative glances, no passive-aggressive comments, no threats or guilt. Just me. And the small apartment that felt like a fortress built with every ounce of my effort and resilience. I took a moment to look around, noticing the sun creeping over the neighboring skyscrapers, splashing soft pinks and golds across the living room walls. My unpacked boxes were quiet sentinels of the life I was building. I'd spent nights meticulously organizing, labeling, and arranging. Not just out of necessity, but as a statement, this is mine, my domain. The exhaustion still clung to me, but there was pride in it, the kind that comes from doing everything yourself, from knowing that this piece wasn't given, it was claimed. I thought back to mornings in my childhood home, the shouting, the door slamming, the anxiety that made my stomach twist before the day even began. Breakfast was never peaceful, it was a battlefield. Every noise, every raised voice drilled into me, that control wasn't mine to have, that my comfort didn't matter. And now, here, the absence of that chaos was deafening in the best way possible. It was proof that my struggle had been worth it, that each sacrifice, each extra hour of work, each skipped social event had led to this moment. For the first time, I felt untouchable, unshakable, like I had purchased not just an apartment, but a fortress around my sanity. I walked to the window and rested my hands on the sill, looking out over the city I'd worked so hard to earn the right to observe from this quiet perch. The streets below moved with the usual chaos, but it was distant, almost irrelevant. Up here, in my new sanctuary, it didn't reach me. I could just breathe. I could just exist. The apartment hummed with life of its own, soft, subtle, the kind that makes the space feel inhabited yet still entirely under my control. Even the small imperfections, the creak in a floorboard, the slight draft by the window, felt intimate, like the apartment itself was breathing with me. I returned to the kitchen, refilled my mug, and leaned against the counter, savoring the ritual. My muscles ached still, a persistent reminder of yesterday's labor. But it was a good ache, a badge of ownership. Every box I'd carried, every night I'd spent on rice and beans while saving for this moment. Every early morning and late night, all of it converged in this one peaceful Saturday morning. I felt gratitude for my own grit, my own resilience, and yes, even a quiet amusement at how far I'd come. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting each step on the hardwood floor remind me that I was no longer a passive participant in someone else's drama. I could wake up like this every morning if I wanted. No one would intrude. No one would dictate the pace of my life. My apartment, with its high ceilings and natural light, its carefully chosen fixtures and finishes, wasn't just a home, it was a statement, a declaration that I mattered, that my life, my time, my peace were not negotiable. I took one last sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through me, and allowed myself a small smile. For the first time in years, I was truly present in my own life. The silence wasn't just a luxury, it was a victory. The tangible proof that every exhausting, lonely, and grueling step I'd taken to get here had been worth it. And yet, beneath that quiet, beneath the calm, there was the faintest pulse of unease because peace, this perfect, often feels too fragile, like a fragile vase balanced on the edge of a table. I didn't know it yet, but that fragile vase was about to be tested, and when it shattered, nothing would ever be the same. The knock came out of nowhere, a harsh, relentless pounding that rattled the heavy oak door in its frame. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a dreamlike echo of my past home's chaos, but then it repeated thud, thud, thud. My stomach dropped. I froze mid-step, coffee mug hovering halfway to my lips. That rhythm was impossible to forget. It was the sound of demands, of authority, of confrontation. It was the knock that meant someone believed they could impose their will on you. And I knew immediately who it was. Arthur, my father. My heart hammered as my mind raced. How did they find the apartment I hadn't shared the address? Not a word. Yet, there he was, standing on my threshold like he had every right to be. Behind him, slouched against the wall and staring at his phone with a practiced air of disinterest, was Frank, my older brother. 3 large suitcases and 2 garbage bags of clothes were piled haphazardly around his feet, each one a declaration of entitlement. I stared at the screen of my digital peephole camera, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't a visit. This was an invasion. It was the universe handing me a test in the form of people I had known my entire life, but had never truly understood. Arthur's presence was immediately commanding. He wore his business jacket over a tweed blazer, the one he only donned when trying to intimidate someone or request money with his signature blend of authority, saw and impatience. His face was flushed from yelling at the concierge downstairs, his eyes narrowing as they swept over the small details of my apartment. He wasn't here to see me, or to congratulate me, or even to engage politely. No, His gaze was critical, appraising, measuring everything I had built as if it were a report card for his own judgment. Frank, by contrast, was the embodiment of lethargy and assumption. He didn't glance at me, didn't acknowledge my existence. He just stared at his phone, lounging like a man who had already decided the apartment and everything in it belonged to him. His hoodie was worn, unwashed, hanging off him in a way that spoke of years without accountability. I could almost feel the air shift with his indifference, like a vacuum sucking out the respect for boundaries that I had spent a decade enforcing for myself. I tightened the sash of my silk robe, my hands trembling despite my best effort to maintain composure. I didn't unlock the door immediately. I took a breath, summoning the Elin mask, the professional, cold, strategic persona I had perfected in boardrooms where arrogance met precision. The mask was armor, a shield against the emotional weight of seeing my sanctuary violated. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, each beat a warning and a reminder that the next moment would demand calm, clarity, and cunning. When I finally clicked the deadbolt and the metal engaged with a sharp, resonant sound, it felt like the trigger of a gun, an audible warning in the quiet apartment. I opened the door, my body poised, and stepped back slightly to let them enter. Arthur didn't offer a greeting, didn't even glance my way. He gestured vaguely at Frank. About time. He grunted, shoving past me into the foyer without invitation. His eyes swept the lighting fixtures, the flooring, the space, scrutinizing as if every detail was an affront or a challenge. The apartment I had fought to claim, the sanctuary I had designed and built with sweat and sacrifice, was being dissected by someone who believed he had inherent authority. Frank finally glanced up from his phone, offering a half-hearted wave and kicking one of his suitcases toward the threshold. "Sup, Evie?" he mumbled. "Do you have Wi-Fi?" "My data is capped." The words were casual, almost trivial, but every syllable was a dagger. "Do you realize how utterly this disregards everything I've worked for?" I thought. My voice remained steady, but my chest felt tight. "Dad, Frank, what are you doing here?" I asked, keeping the words measured, though inside my mind, the betrayal roared louder than any alarm. Arthur's response was the embodiment of entitlement. His face twisted into that familiar, scornful expression I had known since childhood. "What does it look like Frank's lease is up?" "He's got nowhere to go." "You have 2 bedrooms? He's staying here?" His certainty was staggering, as if my home, my rules, my life were mere suggestions rather than realities. Each word landed like a physical blow, the kind that makes you question the solidity of every boundary you've set. And here they were, trampling over years of work, effort, and personal triumph, as casually as if they were entering a public space. Frank began maneuvering his belongings inside, leaving dirt streaks across my pristine floors, ignoring every polite warning I offered. "Careful with the floors," I said automatically, a habit ingrained from years of living with people who didn't care about shared space. He didn't even look down. The sense of violation settled in my chest, heavy and sharp. I could feel every ounce of my patience fraying, stretched tight across the room by their casual disregard. Arthur wandered into the kitchen, opening cupboards and sampling apples as if the space had been built for his convenience. "He's moving in," he announced nonchalantly, chewing loudly, as if that alone made the decision legitimate. The betrayal struck harder than any physical blow, not just for the intrusion, but for the underlying message, my decade of sacrifice. The work to secure my independence meant nothing. They had assumed my success was a resource to tap into, my hard-earned sanctuary a shared asset for their comfort and entitlement. I felt frozen in the hallway, the cool draft from the corridor chilling my ankles, my body caught between action and shock. Frank had successfully maneuvered 2 suitcases inside and was now struggling with a plastic bin patched together with duct tape. The disrespect was tangible, physical, and yet somehow invisible to him. He dropped it with a heavy thud, scratching the hardwood finish, not even a glance downward. My sanctuary had been violated in the most literal sense, and every instinct screamed at me that this was just the beginning. The absurdity of Arthur's entitlement hit me fully when he assigned rooms with a casual disregard for reality. The second one has a view of the park. I need natural light if I'm going to focus on my streaming career. My mind went blank for a beat, processing the audacity. Frank had been out of work for years, yet here was a proclamation of priorities, as if my apartment and my labor were simply tools for their needs. I blinked, trying to ground myself in reality. Streaming career. Frank, you haven't held a job since the gas station incident 3 years ago? The words escaped in disbelief more than anger. Arthur's transformation into enforcer mode was instantaneous. He invaded my personal space, the stale tobacco and cheap aftershave assaulting me as he leaned in, lowering his voice into a growl that demanded compliance. "Now you listen to me," he said. "Your mother and I have discussed this. Molly is worried about Frank. He needs stability. You have this, he stays." The entitlement was wrapped in moral obligation, each syllable engineered to crush my independence. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to assert dominion, to make me complicit in their assumptions about family and loyalty. I could feel every nerve in my body screaming, my heart pounded, my hands itched to react, yet I held my stance. This wasn't a negotiation of preferences, it was a test of boundaries, a confrontation of everything I had built and earned. The apartment, my peace, my sanctuary, had been breached by those who assumed it was theirs to manipulate. The tension was palpable, thick enough to last. I realized that the stakes weren't just about space, they were about control, respect, and recognition. They assumed my silence, my compliance, as entitlement to override my life. And I knew, deep down, that this was where the story truly began, where every lesson, every sacrifice of the past decade would be challenged by the audacity of family entitlement. Arthur didn't even wait for an answer. He marched through my apartment with that authoritative gait I'd known my whole life. Each step a reminder that he believed he owned the room, the space, and somehow my compliance. He didn't look at me, except in glances heavy with judgment and expectation. Frank followed behind like a shadow, dragging his bags with the casual entitlement of someone who believed the world owed him everything. I watched them, my pulse racing, every nerve on edge, realizing that my sanctuary, my peace, was being systematically dismantled. "Don't just stand there, Evelyn," Arthur barked, voice low and commanding, yet somehow rehearsed, like he'd delivered this line 1,000 times before. "Help your brother with the bags. He's got a bad back." I froze. The words hit me in layers: outrage, disbelief, and a bitter, familiar sense of being invisible. My mind raced. A bad back. Frank, the same man who had spent years avoiding responsibility, letting life drift by while I scraped and clawed for every inch of my independence. I could almost hear the years of my own sacrifices, laughing in bitter irony at the audacity. I didn't speak immediately, trying to steady the flood of emotions, to calculate my response. This was the pattern I had lived with: Arthur commanding, Frank assuming, and me forever the compliant, invisible child. Frank didn't even glance up from his phone. "Sup," he muttered again, tossing one of his garbage bags aside like it had no weight, no consequence. I had a reflexive desire to correct him, to assert that my floors weren't trash bins, that my time wasn't to be trampled. But I forced myself to inhale slowly. Anger alone wouldn't restore the order. I needed strategy. Arthur strolled into my kitchen, opening cupboards, inspecting my fruit bowl. "He's moving in," he said casually, biting into an apple. The crunch loud in the silent apartment. Each bite felt like a statement, a punctuation on the audacity of his intrusion. "You're letting him live here." His tone was both a command and a justification. as if the legality of his demand existed independently of my autonomy. The betrayal pressed against me like a physical weight. 10 years of earning, of building, of sleepless nights, and careful planning erased by a few casual words. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. Dad, Frank, I just moved in yesterday. I haven't even unpacked my own things. My words sounded small in the echo of the apartment, but internally, they carried the fury of every moment of manipulation, every ounce of effort that had been disregarded. Arthur waved a dismissive hand, as if I were a fly buzzing annoyingly in his space. Now, don't be dramatic. He needs a place to stay, and you have it. Family helps family. Family helps family. Evelyn, you're strong, you can handle things. Family helps family. The mantra hung in the air like a weapon. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat, sharp and involuntary. Family had helped Frank at every turn. Yes, while I had been the one starved of acknowledgement, support, and even basic decency, the words themselves were a cruel inversion of reality, twisted to coerce me into compliance. I clenched my jaw, focusing on the fact that his authority depended entirely on my reaction. If I yielded, he had won. If I didn't, the game would change. Frank wandered into the living room, kicking at my sofa cushions with dirty shoes, as if testing the resilience of my sanctuary. Careful with the floors, I said again, automatically. He didn't respond. He didn't see me. He didn't see the 10 years of my labor, the sacrifices etched into every inch of the apartment. He only saw a resource to exploit, a space to inhabit with no accountability. The sense of entitlement radiating from him was almost intangible, like a physical force pressing into my chest. Arthur paced behind him, muttering about streaming careers and natural light, weaving a narrative where my efforts and resources were invisible, my independence irrelevant. The second room has a view. He needs sunlight for his streaming career. He said, as if the absurdity of the statement gave it legitimacy. You wouldn't get it, you're just a corporate drone, he added, eyes narrowing, weaponizing my life choices against me. The audacity was staggering, but it also revealed the predictable pattern, the logic I could exploit. They believed that my compliance was automatic, that my years of discipline could be overridden by their insistence and theatrics. I clenched my fists, but outwardly I remained calm, noting their movements, their habits, their assumptions, Arthur's authority, his reliance on moral pressure, and Frank's parasitic entitlement. They were a team designed to erode boundaries. And I had been anticipating this confrontation for a long time, though I hadn't known when it would arrive. My thoughts raced, cataloging every slight, every manipulation, every expectation of obedience. The psychological weight of decades of this pattern pressed down on me. But I could also feel the flicker of control returning as I reminded myself that knowledge, preparation, and patience were my weapons. Arthur leaned against the counter, tapping his fingers, observing me with a smug certainty. You have money? You can afford it. Be generous, he said, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, patting my cheek in a gesture that was at once patronizing and possessive. Don't forget where you came from. Evelyn. His assertion was layered a reminder of past dependence, a thinly veiled threat, a claim on my compliance. I felt the familiar tightening of my chest, the pulse of anger and recognition, but I forced my expression to remain composed, betraying none of the inner turbulence. Frank, sprawled across the sofa with a bag of chips in his lap, chipped in casually. So, I'm getting a stipend. Right. His tone was playful, oblivious to the magnitude of what he was asking, yet underneath it was a demand born of years of unearned expectations. My pulse quickened. $1,000 a month, free rent, food his life funded by my labor, my sacrifices, my years of restraint. The audacity was breathtaking, but I suppressed the immediate outrage, calculating the moment when action would be most effective. Emotional reaction alone would only feed the power dynamic they believed they owned. Arthur shifted, leaning closer, as if the physical proximity would reinforce his psychological claim. You're strong. You can handle this. Frank is sensitive. He's finding himself. You will support him. Every word, a test, every syllable, an attempt to mold reality to fit their narrative. I swallowed, holding on to the calm edge of strategic clarity. No amount of moral pressure could undo the reality I had earned my independence. I had built boundaries with the currency of sweat, time, and foresight. I allowed a small, bitter smile to cross my face. And how long will that be, I asked, letting the words hang in the space between us. Arthur's eyes narrowed, but the question was necessary. The audacity of assuming permanence, of assuming my resources, demanded confrontation. Frank, still unaware of the emotional gravity, pulled chips from his hoodie and crumbled them across the rug. The casual disrespect was infuriating, yet it also clarified the stakes. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a test of resolve, of autonomy, of recognition that I would no longer serve as a passive reservoir for entitlement. As Arthur's face hardened and his voice rose, the psychological stakes crystallized. I realized fully that their strategy was dual. Arthur applied moral authority, the weight of familial obligation, and the implication of threat. Frank applied passive, insidious entitlement, the casual assertion that the world owed him without effort. Together, they formed a nearly perfect storm designed to erode the very foundation of my autonomy. The emotional stakes were high-yielding, would mean erasure of my hard-won independence, the violation of boundaries, the surrender to patterns I had spent a decade dismantling. And yet, as they moved through the apartment, dismissing my existence, testing my patience, and claiming entitlement over my life and space, I felt a shift. The anger, the betrayal, the recognition of past injustices, they became fuel. Each audacious act of theirs, each casual disregard for my years of sacrifice, each assumed authority, these were all data points in a system I had been analyzing for years. The dynamics of control, entitlement, and manipulation were no longer abstract. They were tangible, observable, predictable. And for the first time, I recognized that knowledge was leverage, and leverage was power. My peace was under threat. Yes, but it was not lost. It was now a challenge to be met with strategy, precision, and an unwavering commitment to preserving my autonomy. I sank onto the edge of the sofa, the weight of the confrontation pressing against me, and for a moment, I let my mind wander back over the past decade. 10 years of working grueling 60-hour weeks as a senior UX designer, taking freelance contracts on weekends, scrimping on food, clothing, anything that wasn't absolutely necessary, all to save every cent for this apartment, this sanctuary. Each sacrifice, every skipped night out, every meal of rice and beans, it had a purpose, a goal that now stood before me in stark contrast to the audacity of Frank and Arthur. I remembered the holidays, the birthdays, the little milestones where my achievements were quietly acknowledged at best, ignored at worst. I brought home gifts, thoughtful gestures, investments in their happiness that were met with a shrug or a passing comment, while Frank's smallest effort was celebrated as monumental. One Christmas, I had landed my first major freelance client. I brought gifts for my parents, a watch for Arthur, a spa day for Molly. Their faces registered nothing more than mild approval. And then Arthur announced, almost theatrically, that Frank was thinking about applying to culinary school. The room erupted in applause, cheering for a potential that never materialized. While my hard-won achievements were buried beneath paper and empty promises, I could feel the sting again, the familiar burn of being the invisible, dutiful child. I was the cactus in a garden of orchids, thriving on neglect while Frank withered at the slightest breeze, only to be coddled and shielded from any consequence. Every time he faltered, Arthur swooped in, shielding him with money, favors, and moral arguments that made me feel complicit if I dared protest. I'd been conditioned to acquiesce, to accept my role as the reliable, uncomplaining one, the one who didn't require nurturing, because anything I wanted was never seen as important. And now, in my own home, the apartment I had purchased with years of toil, the sacrifices became painfully tangible. Every expensive detail, from the high thread count sheets to the imported hardwood floors, each piece of furniture painstakingly chosen and paid for with my own earnings, was a testament to my labor. This wasn't just an apartment, it was freedom, independence, proof that I had survived, endured, and ultimately had earned the right to peace. Yet here they were, treating it as if it were theirs to command, their entitlement so natural it was almost laughable. I could feel the resentment bubbling up, a hot, simmering anger at the pattern of favoritism that had followed me for years. My life had been a ledger of sacrifices, carefully balanced against Frank's unearned gains. I remembered times I had stretched every dollar, worked through sickness, stayed late nights in offices and studios, all while Frank coasted, relying on parental safety nets and the occasional handout disguised as the moral obligation. And Arthur, the enforcer, the arbiter of fairness in their twisted world, had always ensured the scale tipped in Frank's favor. My victories were private, my losses unacknowledged, my labor invisible, and now all that invisibility was being tested in the most personal, most invasive way. I let myself sink deeper into reflection, letting the memories flow freely. I thought about the sleepless nights after grueling workdays, the student loans I paid off on my own, the years I went without comfort. Each moment an investment in a future where I could finally control my environment. The apartment wasn't just a home, it was a statement, a fortress built from discipline, perseverance, and quiet suffering. And yet Arthur and Frank treated it as if my labor entitled them to automatic access, a resource to be consumed at their whim. The betrayal stung, sharper than any physical confrontation. It was a violation not just of my space, but of the very essence of the struggle that had defined me for a decade. I remembered the small injustices, Frank wrecking Arthur's sedan and receiving a pat on the back while I drove a used Honda for years. He showed up high at holiday dinners and yet got the largest portion of the roast because he needed strength, while I scraped by, sustaining myself on the edges of family attention and affection. Every pattern repeated itself with exhausting regularity, my diligence and responsibility ignored. His failings coddled. It was a cycle, meticulously orchestrated by Arthur, reinforced by the family dynamics, and deeply internalized by me until now. And here it was, surfacing in the doorway, in the bags, in the casual imperatives of the two people who believed my sanctuary was theirs to command. And yet, despite the anger, despite the sense of betrayal, there was a strange clarity in that reflection. I understood the pattern, the why behind their audacity, knowledge, strategy, and recognition of the dynamics I had endured for years were tools I could wield. The decade of sacrifice hadn't been in vain. It had given me not just a home, but insight, patience, and perspective. Every meal I skipped, every extra hour I worked, every boundary I had quietly reinforced in other contexts had prepared me for this confrontation. The emotional stakes were immense, but the clarity of my purpose was sharper. I let myself smile faintly at the thought. The apartment was mine, not because they couldn't claim it, but because I had built it with my own hands, my own discipline, and my own mind. The unfairness of the past, the favoritism, the overlooked achievements, the relentless pressure to accommodate Frank had shaped me. Yes, but it had also honed me. It had taught me patience, strategy, and the subtle art of reading people, of anticipating the moves of those who assume power simply by existing. And now, in my own space, with my own rules, those lessons were about to come into play. I sipped my coffee again, letting the warmth anchor me. The exhaustion lingered, a dull ache beneath the surface. But it was different now. It wasn't just physical, it was the residue of years of persistence, of carrying burdens alone, of making sacrifices that no one acknowledged. And yet, beneath that exhaustion was a quiet satisfaction. The deep knowledge that I had earned this moment, this apartment, this sanctuary. I had converted years of struggle into a fortress, and though it was under threat now, it was fortified not just by locks and doors, but by the experience, insight, and resolve I had accumulated. I thought about the psychological weight of family expectation, the way they had conditioned me to serve as the reliable one, the one who wouldn't complain, the one who would absorb the consequences of Frank's failures. The resentment was palpable, yes, but so was a hardened resolve. I understood fully now that their intrusion wasn't random, it was predictable, based on a pattern they had relied upon for years. But patterns can be disrupted, systems can be broken, and the decade of sacrifice that had built my sanctuary was also the decade that had prepared me to defend it, strategically, emotionally, and psychologically. In that reflection, I felt both the exhaustion of the past and the power of the present coexisting. I had endured, I had labored, I had saved, and I had claimed my peace. The apartment, the sunlight, the quiet hum of the city outside, the aroma of coffee curling in the air, they were proof that my efforts had a tangible, unassailable outcome. And now, as the shadow of entitlement pressed against my door, I realized that this reflection wasn't just nostalgia or anger, it was preparation. It was the grounding that would allow me to respond, to act, to assert boundaries that had been ignored for far too long. The stakes were personal, emotional, and profound, but so was the knowledge that I had finally earned the right to defend them. I leaned back slightly, taking in the scene before me, Arthur pacing like a general, Frank sprawled on my sofa like he owned the place, and my apartment, my carefully curated, meticulously earned sanctuary, under siege. For a split second, I allowed the old panic to surface, the one that would have had me apologizing, acquiescing, smoothing over the chaos just to keep the peace. But that instinct was a reflex from years past, and I wasn't that girl anymore. Not here, not now. I breathed, slow and deliberate, letting the hum of the city outside seep in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun painted soft gold across the hardwood floors, illuminating the absurdity of the scene, my brother kicking around bags, my father wielding moral authority like a weapon, and me, the only one with the knowledge and foresight to see the entire system. That knowledge was my leverage. It always had been, though I'd never realized how much until this moment. Observing them, I noted Arthur's predictability, his reliance on authority, moral pressure, and intimidation. His gestures, the way he emphasized words with a slight forward lean, the casual swipe at my shoulders, were all part of the performance he had perfected over decades. Frank, by contrast, was the passive vector, the lever he used to apply moral force. Frank's laziness, his oblivious entitlement, was a tool, and together, they were dangerous. But every tool has a flaw, every system a vulnerability, and I had spent 10 years learning exactly how to exploit them. I set my mug down with deliberate calm, letting the sound resonate in the quiet apartment. Their eyes flicked toward me, Arthur's narrowing with mild annoyance, Frank's lazy, curious. I allowed a small smile to curve my lips, not malicious, just quietly knowing. Before we talk about stipends, room assignments, or anything else, I said, my voice calm but firm, there's something we need to go over. Their postures shifted slightly, subtle but noticeable. Arthur's eyebrow twitched. Frank perked up a little from the sofa, as if sensing a shift in the balance he hadn't anticipated. That was my first win attention. The room's dynamics were changing, and they didn't know it yet. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, picking up a clipboard with files I had prepared weeks ago. Each document was meticulously organized: tax returns, emails, loan applications, receipts, public records, years of experience as a UX designer and freelancer, years of handling Arthur's documents for him, had given me a unique perspective. I understood how to trace discrepancies, follow a paper trail, anticipate the reactions of someone who assumed knowledge was a shield. And now, that knowledge was my weapon. Arthur's voice rose, attempting to reclaim dominance. You're overthinking this. It's family. You don't need to make it complicated. He gestured vaguely at Frank, who is now lounging in the recliner, a soda can dangling from his fingers, the casual arrogance, the assumption that I would comply, that I would hesitate, that I would fold. Those were cracks I could exploit. I let the words wash over me, inwardly cataloging the missteps, the oversights, the arrogance that made their behavior predictable. I opened the folder, placing the first sheet on the counter between us. Let's look at the facts, I said, voice crisp and professional. Arthur leaned forward, a small smirk playing on his lips, clearly anticipating that I'd flinch or change course. Frank shifted uneasily, sensing that the routine he relied on, the assumption of passive acceptance, might be disrupted. I started with the subtle points first: a lease application Arthur had submitted 18 months ago, one that listed me as a tenant in their house, a claim I had never authorized. My signature, looped and shaky, compared to the one I actually used, was clearly forged. Do you recognize this? I asked, laying it flat, letting my gaze meet Arthur's. I spoke slowly, letting each word soak in. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't attacking. I was stating facts, presenting evidence. Arthur froze, his color draining slightly. I don't know what that is, he whispered, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed him. Frank leaned in, mouthful of chips, squinting at the paper, confused. Wait, you were paying them rent? He asked innocently, highlighting the gap in understanding between them and me. Yes, Frank, I said, eyes still locked on my father. But I wasn't paying, so... You were, He forged it. He used my name and credit to secure a loan, $60,000 against a property I had nothing to do with. My tone was calm, almost conversational, but beneath it was the sharp edge of authority. Each phrase was a calculated step, moving the game board, adjusting the balance of power in real time. Arthur's shoulders stiffened, the mask of the benevolent father cracking. It's just paperwork, he muttered. I needed the loan to fix the foundation, to protect the house. I let the words hang for a beat. The absurdity was clear, but I didn't mock it. I simply projected the evidence onto my TV screen via AirPlay, the settlement record for damages to an apartment complex Frank had trashed. Payment $58,500, recipient the property management company. You didn't fix the house. Dad, I said slowly, deliberately, letting each syllable land. You paid off Frank's mess, using my identity, using my credit. Frank went silent, the soda can lowering slowly. He shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the comfortable pattern he relied on, the assumption of invisibility and compliance, was gone. Arthur's face, meanwhile, turned red, then gray, then a mix of shock and fury. The performance was cracking, the script unraveling, and I didn't have to do anything more than let the evidence speak. I moved the next document forward: tax filings, emails, records of background checks I had conducted over the years for freelance work, all correlating Frank's activities with the financial maneuvers Arthur had orchestrated. The patterns were undeniable. My decade of preparation, of observing and assisting, of knowing the gaps and weaknesses in their system, was paying off. Each piece of evidence, each fact, shifted the tension in the room. I could see it in their eyes, the subtle twitch of worry, the hesitation, the uncertainty. "You thought you could trap me in my own apartment," I said, voice calm, almost conversational. "But I've been preparing for this for a very long time. And now, with facts and evidence, the leverage is mine. The rules of the game have changed." Arthur's jaw tightened. Frank slouched lower, sensing the loss of control. I wasn't aggressive. I was precise, methodical, confident. That confidence unsettled them more than anger ever could. I poured myself a sip of coffee, slow and deliberate, letting the mundane act anchor me in normalcy. They were off balance, reacting to me instead of dictating my response. That shift, the subtle but profound reversal of roles, was satisfying in a quiet, strategic way. I had anticipated their moves, cataloged the data, prepared contingencies. My knowledge wasn't just power, it was protection, a shield that now became a sword. I continued walking them through each discrepancy, each manipulated document, each instance of entitlement, letting the evidence speak louder than any shouting match could. Arthur tried to argue, to deflect, to invoke moral authority and family obligation, but I countered with facts, timing, records, public filings. Frank attempted casual interjections, but each was met with calm, factual clarity that left them disarmed. Every step, every carefully measured statement subtly shifted the room's dynamic. I was no longer on the defensive. I was orchestrating the confrontation, turning their aggression into hesitation. By the time I placed the last piece of evidence on the counter, the air in the apartment had changed. Arthur, the once commanding patriarch, was visibly unsettled, shuffling his weight, looking for a response that wouldn't come. Frank, the entitled parasite, was slouched but tense, suddenly conscious that the rules they had always relied on, the assumptions of compliance and invisibility, no longer applied. The high ground, the leverage, had shifted, and it was mine. I could feel the satisfaction building, not in vindictiveness, but in the quiet, meticulous reclaiming of control. I sat down in the armchair, crossing my legs and sipping coffee, as if nothing had changed. And yet everything had. The apartment, my sanctuary, the product of a decade of sacrifice, was now defended not by walls or locks alone, but by strategy, preparation, and unflinching calm. Arthur and Frank had assumed dominance, entitlement, authority, but I had dismantled it, step by step, fact by fact, observation by observation. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a victory over them, it was a reclamation of myself, of every sacrifice, of every moment I had invested in building my life, my peace, and my independence. I could feel the tension coiled tight in the apartment, a living thing pressing against every surface. When I decided it was time, the air was thick with entitlement and assumption. Arthur pacing, Frank sprawled like a lazy monarch, and me, finally calm, finally in control. I took a breath, steady and deliberate, letting the rhythm of the apartment, the soft hum of the city, the faint creak of the floors anchor me. Every ounce of fear, every flash of panic from the morning had been transformed into focus. This was it, the culmination of preparation, observation, and the knowledge I had painstakingly amassed over years. I picked up the first sheet from the meticulously organized folder on the counter. The lease application. Arthur had submitted it 18 months ago, listing me as a tenant in their house, claiming I paid $1,500 a month in rent, when I had lived there not at all. My signature, obviously forged, looped and shaky in ways that betrayed its falsity. I laid it flat, ensuring both of them could see. My voice steady, conversational, almost casual. "Do you recognize this?" Arthur froze, his shoulders tensed, and for a moment, he looked like a child caught in a lie. Frank, mouthful of chips, squinted at the document, confused. "Wait, you were paying them rent?" he asked, genuinely bewildered. "Yes, Frank," I said slowly, letting the weight of each word land. "But I wasn't paying. You weren't paying." He forged it. He used my name and my credit to secure a $60,000 loan against a property I had nothing to do with. My tone was calm, but beneath it lay the unyielding precision of every step I had taken to prepare for this confrontation. Arthur's mask of control faltered, a twitch of panic brushing across his face. Arthur's voice dropped, small and defensive. "It's just paperwork. I needed the loan to fix the foundation, to protect the house." I let the silence stretch, letting the absurdity of the claim settle between us. Then, with deliberate movement, I tapped the screen of my phone, projecting an AirPlay display onto my large television. Settlement records, payment of $58,500 to the property management group for damages caused by Frank to a rental unit. Dates matched almost perfectly to the disbursement of the loan Arthur had taken out. "You didn't fix the house." "Dad," I said slowly, deliberately, letting the calm of my voice contrast with the magnitude of the accusation. "You paid for Frank to destroy someone else's apartment, and you used my identity to do it." Frank lowered his soda can, suddenly aware, uncomfortable in a way he hadn't been in years. He shuffled in his seat, squinting at the numbers and dates, realizing perhaps for the first time that the comfortable assumptions he relied on had been violated. Arthur, meanwhile, went from red to gray, shock and rage mingling on his face. My calm demeanor, the quiet precision, unsettled him far more than anger ever could. I moved to the next set of documents: tax filings, emails, and records of background checks I had run for freelance work, all correlating with Frank's patterns of misbehavior and Arthur's financial maneuvers. Each document was a piece of the puzzle, each fact laid out in plain sight. I spoke clearly, explaining the connections, the timing, the impact of the forged lease, the loan disbursement, and the settlement. "This isn't just about money," I said. "It's about identity theft, fraud, and misuse of family trust. You committed a felony, and this is the proof." Arthur's eyes darted around the room, looking for support, validation, but there was none. Frank's jaw slackened, chips forgotten. He was quiet, the passive parasitic energy drained by the sudden clarity that the system they had relied upon for so long was unraveling. My calm confidence, the unflinching way I presented facts and evidence, shifted the power entirely. I wasn't yelling, I wasn't pleading, I was stating truth, methodically, systematically, and in that truth, authority had shifted. "Let's talk about the loan itself," I continued, pacing slowly now, projecting the documents toward the screen. The lease application listed me as a paying tenant. That was false. The bank issued $60,000 based on that claim. That money was used to cover Frank's damages he caused, not you. You put both your home and my identity at risk for him. That's fraud. Arthur tried to interject, but I held up a hand, letting him know this was not a debate, but a presentation of facts. He flinched, realizing he was no longer in control. I could feel the subtle shift in Frank, the recognition that the comfortable system he relied on, the assumption that I would quietly accommodate him, that the resources of my labor and patience were endless, had been dismantled. He shifted in the recliner, unsteady, unsure where to place himself. The smugness, the entitlement, the assumption of immunity, all dissolved under the calm weight of evidence. And Arthur, Well, he was unraveling before my eyes, the threads of his authority fraying as the reality of exposure settled in. I continued, moving through the documents with precision, explaining each discrepancy, each manipulation, each moment where the assumptions of entitlement and invisibility had been violated. Every time you assumed I would comply, every time you leveraged my labor, my savings, or my credit, you counted on patterns you believed I couldn't disrupt. But I have anticipated these moves, I have cataloged them, and now the outcome is clear. Arthur's breathing became shallow, rapid. His eyes darted to Frank, to the documents, to me, searching for an angle, a misstep, a loophole. There was none. Frank leaned forward, frowning, the chips long forgotten. His lazy confidence evaporated. He whispered something, perhaps a weak protest, but it barely reached my ears over the gravity of the evidence laid bare in front of them. I was in control, not through aggression or anger, but through preparation, strategy, and the unassailable clarity of truth. I let the moment stretch, allowing the weight of the information to settle. Silence dominated the apartment, heavier than any shouting match could have been. Arthur's face passed through every stage of realization shock, disbelief, denial, desperation. Frank, meanwhile, looked smaller, more vulnerable than he had in years. Realizing that the unearned privileges he had counted on were evaporating under the light of scrutiny, I sipped my coffee, calm, steady, letting the tension build not through theatrics but through undeniable evidence. Now, I said, placing the final document on the counter, you can choose how to respond. But the facts remain: fraud, identity theft, and misuse of funds. These are not opinions. They are evidence. And while I have the power to act, I prefer to let you understand the magnitude of what has been done before taking further steps. Arthur's face paled further. His voice, once commanding, faltered. I didn't mean, you didn't mean, I repeated. Voice calm, cutting through the evasion. Arthur, the intent doesn't negate the action. You used my identity, my credit, and my reputation to secure the funds for your son's mistakes. That's a felony. And now you are exposed. Frank shifted uncomfortably, finally aware of the scale of the situation. I didn't, he began. But his protest faded under the clarity of the evidence. I let him stew in the realization that the comfortable pattern he relied on for years, the assumption that his failures would always be absorbed, that he was untouchable, was gone. He was accountable now, whether he liked it or not. Arthur's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him as the implications sank in. I didn't think, he whispered, and the repetition only emphasized the starkness of the truth laid bare. I wasn't yelling, I wasn't emotional. I was calm, precise, factual. That calmness, backed by methodical preparation and tangible evidence, dismantled the authority he had wielded for decades. I walked over to the sofa, placing the document strategically where both could see. Frank, your privileges, your assumptions of immunity are based on a pattern of abuse and manipulation. And Dad, your sense of authority, your reliance on moral pressure has crumbled under the weight of fact. This is not about punishment, it's about accountability. And now, the room, the space, and the narrative have shifted. Frank's expression changed further, eyes wide, the casual entitlement replaced by something resembling fear, or at least realization. Arthur's bluster had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a man confronted with the magnitude of his errors and the futility of his assumptions. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. I could see it in their posture, their hesitation, the subtle shift of energy in the room. I was no longer defensive. I had reclaimed authority with precision and confidence. I let the silence dominate, letting them absorb each detail, each fact, each document, My calm confidence, the deliberate pacing, the unshakable presentation of evidence was itself a statement. It said more than words ever could. This is my space, my life, my decision. The mistakes of the past, the manipulations, the entitlement, they no longer held power over me. They were exposed, accountable, and finally, I was free from the psychological patterns that had dictated my existence for decades. The room remained tense, the weight of truth pressing down. Arthur finally sank into a chair, defeated. Defeated not by anger, not by argument, but by the undeniable facts laid bare. Frank slouched, unsure, the casual confidence of years gone, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of reality. And I, calm, composed, and methodical, allowed myself a small sense of satisfaction, not in revenge, but in the quiet, undeniable reclamation of autonomy and peace. The climax had arrived, and the stakes had been met with precision, strategy, and the unyielding authority of truth. I had shifted from defensive to strategic, from overwhelmed to in control, and the balance of power in my life had irrevocably changed. The air felt lighter after the confrontation, like the tension that had weighed down my apartment for years had finally lifted. Molly, for the first time in decades, stood firm. She took control with a quiet but undeniable authority. No yelling, no manipulations, just clear, decisive action. Arthur and Frank were left floundering, the pedestal of entitlement they had relied upon crumbling beneath them. They had miscalculated, assuming that intimidation and guilt could bend me or Molly, and now the power dynamic had shifted completely. We moved quickly to address the practical fallout. The house, the source of so many manipulations and financial missteps, had to be sold to protect the equity and prevent foreclosure. I worked alongside Molly and our lawyer to ensure everything was executed properly. There was no drama on our side, just methodical, strategic action. Arthur's protests fell flat. His bluster no longer carried the weight it once had. Frank shuffled along, finally realizing that he couldn't coast on family goodwill forever. There was no room for excuses anymore. Within days, a cash offer arrived. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to cover the outstanding loans, the HLOC, and the closing costs. Molly received her fair share, her freedom and financial security restored. Arthur and Frank, however, faced the consequences of their own reckless actions. Arthur took his portion and rented a modest apartment with Frank, forcing them into a reality they had avoided for years. The dynamic of control, once dominated by manipulation and intimidation, had shifted. They were no longer untouchable, no longer able to bend circumstances to their whim. Frank found work. Finally, a night shift at a warehouse. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the streaming career he had imagined, but it was accountability. He was earning, paying for his own food, making small but meaningful steps toward independence. The same patterns that had allowed him to exploit the family for years had been broken. Arthur's schemes could no longer shield him, and I watched it unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and quiet relief, knowing that boundaries had been established and lessons had been learned. Back in my apartment, the quiet returned, but it was different now. Weighty, earned, filled with the satisfaction of justice and closure. The traces of Frank's intrusion were gone. The rug had been professionally cleaned, the floors unmarred, and the apartment felt once again like a sanctuary. I could breathe fully, move freely, and live on my own terms. Every corner, every fixture, every soft ray of sunlight filtering through the windows reminded me that my effort, patience, and strategic thinking had preserved this peace. I reflected on the family cycle that had caused so much pain, the favoritism, the entitlement, the manipulation. But seeing Molly take control, seeing Frank face consequences, and knowing Arthur could no longer wield fear as leverage, I understood that cycles could be broken, Justice didn't always require vengeance. Sometimes it simply required clarity, preparation, and the courage to uphold boundaries. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel fully present in my life, fully in charge of my space and my choices. The peace of my apartment was no longer fragile. It was fortified by experience, knowledge, and the hard-won lessons of a decade of labor and strategy. I knew now that protecting my boundaries was not selfish, it was necessary. And in that protection, I found empowerment, a sense of closure that went far beyond material security. I poured myself a glass of wine, watching the city lights glow softly outside. The hum of the apartment, once tense with anticipation and conflict, now resonated with quiet contentment. This was my space, my life, and my peace, reclaimed and preserved. The knock at the door, the invasion, the manipulation, all of it had been a test of resolve, and I had passed. I smiled to myself, knowing that boundaries, once asserted and respected, could hold. And for the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't just expensive, it was meaningful, a testament to endurance, strategy, and the quiet triumph of finally being in control. And just like that, the apartment is quiet again, a sanctuary finally reclaimed, boundaries were drawn, lessons learned, and peace restored, not the kind of peace that's given, but the kind you earn and protect. It's a reminder that standing your ground, even when it's hard, can completely change the dynamic. If this story resonated, stick around for more moments where courage and clarity tip the scales, hit that like button and subscribe quietly, because some victories are worth sharing,